Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's episode of the Sports Science Insights. Today, I'm joined by Naomi Myhill, who's a sports science consultant working across multiple organisations. Naomi, thanks for joining us and hope you're doing well.
Hi, Steve. Thanks for having me.
No, thank you. And again, it's great that you've been able to come on and recovered from a concussion and obviously the injury over the last couple of weeks to make it to the podcast. So thank you very much as well. I'm sure we'll explain that later on in the show as well.
I think the listeners need a bit more context on that.
Yeah, but I'll let you provide that. But if you, it'd be great if we can maybe get a little bit of context about you first of all, and why potentially we're here on this podcast talking about you and your background and your research as well, if that's okay.
Yeah, so I guess as you mentioned, I'm a sports science consultant, and I recently finished my PhD earlier in the year in physical performance in women's football. So my background's kind of more sports science, physical orientated, particularly towards women's sports. But currently, at the minute, I work across men's and women's football specifically. So, I guess trying to improve player performance on the pitch, and upskill kind of practitioners, and the wider workforce into what's best in terms of techniques to employ and research strategies as well.
Nice, thank you for that. And I suppose where kind of have you got your experience from within your career so far, if you don't mind me asking?
Yeah, so previously I was working with the FA for my PhD for the last 4 years, and that was on the women's professional game side. So my PhD and the work I was supporting was across from the Women's Super League, the Championship, and the WSL academies, which are now pro game academies. Um, Previous to that, I did work at Loughborough Sport. Is as a physiology support to kind of the athletics team there and the middle distance runners. I've also worked as a lecturer in sports science too, and currently I support City Football Group, Man City, as a research innovation and sports science consultant across their kind of women's first team academy and men's academies as well.
Nice. It sounds like you've got your hands full and you're pretty busy all the time as well. So, and I've been fortunate, I've got to see some of your journey over the last few years as well. And I can vouch to the listeners that you still have your Loughborough University kit and you still wear it at sometimes as well. So I know that you are Loughborough proud as well. But it'd be good to probably just dive in before we go into your PhD. It's really interesting to see how you've developed into like this researcher. And so, how do you go about solving like research problems and performance questions for these organizations? What's kind of like your pathway to establishing what you do and how you do it as well?
Yeah, I think this is something that I probably developed over the last 4 years and honed my kind of skill set within this space because I think particularly now there is a lot of data everywhere. There's lots of ways we can collect data. There's a lot of clubs and organizations that have data, but the risk is, well, are we collecting data for data's sake? So for me, you always have to have a reason. There needs to be a research question. So any kind of research project has to answer a performance question that a club or organization has. And that performance question should align with a key strategy that that club or organization has kind of higher up that they need um, for that to be successful. Because if we're kind of doing research for research sake, there is a danger that, over the cycle of a research project, we might get some outcomes, but once that project is finished, it gets dead and buried and it's never looked at again in terms of those outputs. So essentially, we don't want to be in a position where you're kind of providing resources, time, energy, cost into something and not actually using the information or the outcomes that we get from a project. So first principle is there needs to be a performance problem or performance question. Then the research project is designed to try and answer that performance question.
I suppose because you've worked across like the like football association and also within a club environment and also a multi club, how do those performance questions differ when you go about solving them as well?
Yeah, so in my role at the FA, performance question was across kind of multiple clubs. So the FA wanted to understand, well, how can we optimize physical performance levels of our elite female players and optimize progression between competitive levels? Like that was the key performance question that I was trying to answer. And that's more league wide and improving the general state of the game. Whereas in a club environment, in a single club environment, those research questions are probably more specific. Um, so they might be, for example, an aim to reduce the risk of ACL injury within kind of the academy team because there's a performance objective that they want to have an average of 85% squad availability through the season. So the kind of nature of the research question differs comparing the organization that you're at. So broad to narrow and more specific.
Yeah, that's cool. And I suppose like thinking thinking back now as well, and like you were one of the lucky PhD students that got to do their studies during lockdown as well, which I'm sure we'll come on to those challenges as well. But why did you decide to do a PhD in women's football as well?
Well, I've always loved football, and I've always played football from a young age. Is my favorite thing to do, but there wasn't when I was younger playing. There wasn't really a clear route into kind of playing and professionally. So I did what probably a lot of people did, and did a sports science degree at university rather than become an athlete. And then once this opportunity came up, I was lecturing at the time, and I kind of had a real like want for more research, and I saw this opportunity with the FA researching in women's football to try and you know improve the standard of the game. At that time, the WSL had just gone fully professional as well a couple of years earlier. So for me, it was a really exciting time to kind of step back into the world of women's football and really try and improve the kind of resources and the environment and ensure that players kind of had the opportunity to reach their potential by giving them everything that we have in terms of what they need. So that was my real kind of reason for being in doing a PhD in women's football. It's the fastest. I mean, women's football is the fastest growing sport in the world. I think there's something like over 60.5 million women and girls that play in football worldwide. And I know in England there's been about 50%, 56% increase in participation in women's football since 2020. So you couple that with participation with professionalism, and professionalism of the game has increased like kind of worldwide. There's over 19,000 players playing professionally worldwide now. So, at the time we were kind of riding that wave, and I thought it was a really good opportunity to contribute and be challenged in an area that I was really passionate about.
It, it's great to hear, and I suppose like you won't know the percentage of like the female players who are playing like football every week now who unfortunately get broken noses within 30 seconds of coming on the pitch or anything like that, will you?
Yeah, I don't know the exact percentage, but yeah, I'm definitely in that in
Yeah,
that small percentage.
yeah. So, for the context of the listeners, again, like unfortunately, Naomi did suffer. Well, you were returning from an ankle injury, first of all, weren't you?
Yeah, I've unfortunately had a bit of an ankle injury for a while now. I've been rehabbing and finally came back and returned to play. I was scheduled to play about 20 minutes, came on the 70th minute, and yeah, within 30 seconds, I broke my nose and got a concussion. So my first touch of the ball was with my nose, which wasn't ideal.
No, but I suppose like again, like well, it's good to just have a little bit of a laugh as well at yourself sometimes as well. But
Yes.
yeah, so where did you actually study your PhD? Sorry, as well. So you were obviously doing it with the FA and answering that question. But where was your PhD at, and who were like the supervisors, and who was involved?
Yeah. So I mentioned the FA, but it was at Leeds Beckett University. So my PhD was kind of a collaboration between Leeds Beckett and the FA. My supervisors were Dr. Stacey Emmons and Dr. Dan Weaving. Um, and then in terms of FA, I had Ryan King and Andy Hudson supporting me there, which was really cool. And then obviously Steve, yourself, Playmaker provided the units for us to collect the data with the PhD as well. So some could say I might have been lucky. I could be sick of you by now, Steve, but
You,
you know, I had your support over 4 years, which was
it,
was pretty helpful.
it will be the latter, no doubt, especially as we are still talking now, or I've managed to bribe you in some way to come on this podcast as well. So hopefully it's you're not sick of me, but it's I suppose like what because every kind of research project will always have like its ups and downs as well. I suppose like you started late 2019, and I think this was even before like we connect as well. So how what was the actual research looking at trying to achieve? For example, you said demands of the games, but can we just dive into a little bit more detail on that as well, if possible?
Yeah, I actually started February 2020, so
February
about 3
2020.
weeks before before the pandemic began. Um, but yeah, the FA kind of had a performance problem, as I mentioned earlier. They wanted to try and solve, and I would kind of that they'd done us some scoping and got to that performance problem before they advertised the PhD, which I think was really key. And that was optimizing physical performance of elite players and progression between competitive levels. So breaking that down, they wanted to know, well, what are the kind of physical locomotor match demands of WSL Championship Academy players? What are the physical and locomotor training demands? And um, are we preparing players in training for those peak high intensity match demands? And so trying to answer those three questions was really the key for the PhD. And also important that it was a multi-club project because there had been some previous research in the area which had done a great job, but wasn't necessarily generalizable specifically to kind of the leagues in England, but also because a lot of them were single club cohort studies. So to be able to generalize those findings, the FA wanted to get a picture of what was happening with our younger players in the academy systems, but also our senior players across those leagues at that period of time.
Nice. So it's great that you got the performance question. Great you got the performance problem. Bearing in mind it was like a few weeks before lockdown, what was the original idea of how to solve it, or what were you going to do to try and answer those questions, shall we say?
Yeah, initially we were going to try and collect match data in that first season using kind of a time motion analysis piece of kit, piece of equipment across multiple teams. And then the second season, we were planning to collect physical data through kind of physical testing batteries. Um, but then COVID happened, and so we had to rethink um, what we were planning to do. One of the key issues as well was when we actually kind of scoped out or what time motion analysis equipment or sensors do clubs have. They all had different systems, for example, different GPS systems, or some had none. Um, so that was a key issue because if we're trying to compare data between clubs, between leagues, they need to be using the same kit, the same technology, um, because every technology has error. So you can't really compare between different tech. So essentially, COVID happened, and we had to change the plan a little bit to still answer the performance problem, but just pivot. And there was a lot of pivoting throughout the PhD,
Sounds
as I'm
like a
sure anyone who's done
predecessor
it.
of this.
Yeah, anyone who's done a PhD will be able to vouch for that as well. But yeah, we essentially pivoted to the first season we'd collect training data, and the second season we'd collect that match data. Um, And so that's where we decided to use Playmaker, which is the foot-mounted inertial measurement unit, to collect that locomotor data, which was provided to all of the teams who participated in the project. And that was really key, having the same technology, which hadn't been done before in terms of a study in women's football, with multi-clubs all using the same technology. So that part was really key for us.
Yeah. So what you're saying in a loose term is that you probably collected the most data on training and match play in the women's game as part of your PhD.
Yes,
I know you're a modest
yes.
person,
I'd
so you're all right to say it as well.
Yes, I think we can. Yeah, that definitely. And there was a lot and a lot of data, massive data sets.
when
Which,
when
yeah.
did you turn from a sports scientist to a data analyst, shall we say?
When I started learning R, then I was like, okay, yeah, I'm not just a sports scientist now, as they'd say. So, yeah,
Although
big data.
again, it's a good kind of discussion. Again, like should sports scientists and researchers actually be better trained up in R and those kind of like different languages to help with those kind of stats? Has it helped you within like your obviously it helps within your PhD, but has it helped you in your future kind of career progression so far, learning R and stuff like that?
Yeah, definitely. I think because, it is difficult to learn R, and it does take a lot of time to kind of learn. Essentially, you're learning a new language, but it's just a program. But yeah, I think it's definitely helped me in that, if there are large data sets coming in, or even like other types of commands I want to do, just to make things easier for me to save time, I know I can just type a few lines of code to get that done in 2 minutes that might have taken me an hour to do manually. And that's really useful when you're very busy in your day-to-day work, and particularly for statistical analysis as well. I think it's a lot more flexible than something like SPSS. So I think now students doing sports science, like, they should be taught programming languages, because it does seem to be, if you look at what job descriptions are around sports science now, a lot of them do require R or Python or something similar, a level of understanding. So, and that definitely wasn't taught when I was doing my undergrad or master's degree. So I think I know now there are some master's degrees starting to teach R studio and R. But yeah, I think there needs to be a bit of a shift and a focus towards that too in the undergrad.
Yeah, I mean, one of our previous guests, Sean McLaren's actually teaching people how to use R, and it's a really good resource if anyone is further interested in doing that as well. I suppose you had the fortune. Dan Weaving was a really good kind of teacher for you in the early stages of your PhD as well. But yeah, I suppose you've talked about what you did. Now I'm conscious of time as well, and obviously, however many page thesis could be summarised into a few minutes. But what were the main findings from your PhD then?
Yeah, so we had some interesting findings, right? So some of them we might have already thought, but we didn't necessarily have the data to back it up. So, for example, like, we found session volume and intensity is greater in the WSL compared to the championship and academies. Match day -4 is particularly a key day that discriminates between those competitive levels, particularly for high speed running and sprint distance. And so, with this kind of information, we fed this back to all the clubs within the project, and those clubs that weren't in the project as well. Um, and we gave them kind of some practical applications in terms of, well, if you do want to mimic the high competitive level, match day -4 is a key day to do that, and potentially giving them some ways that they could do that too. Like, we don't know what the gold standard is, because we're not saying that WSL is the gold standard, um, but this is what the higher competitive level is. We found, particularly in academies, that actually the locomotor characteristics are similar across all outfield positions than WSL academy matches, which was quite a surprise, really, if you look at kind of the research within the senior game. And there was also some research by Alice Harkness Armstrong within under 16s and under 14s that found there were significant differences between kind of wide players and central players. But we didn't find that in the WSL academies. And we had 11 out of the 14 academy teams were participating in this project, and we collected data from. So, like, that's a large spread of the league. And what that means really, or it could mean, is that, for coaches and practitioners, then from a physical perspective, players might be able to cope playing in all different positions, a bit more adaptable. However, that's not taking into consideration the technical demands of those positions. So that was an interesting finding. What I think is probably the most interesting finding is that academy players are not prepared for peak match intensities in ball drills. So if we remember what kind of one of our performance questions is, are we preparing players in training for the peak demands or the match demands? The answer in the academies is no, we're not in ball drills. So essentially, we found that I think it was only 2.2% of observations in ball drills were at peak match intensity or higher. So we don't know what the golden nugget number is, but players need to be exposed to peak match intensities to be prepared for them within training. And 2.2% isn't enough of observations. Like, drill prescription underpins the intensity of a session. So if players aren't being exposed to those peak match intensities of average speed, high speed running, sprint distance, and your high magnitude accels and decels, like, that's a problem, because those ball drills represent 80% of training time, and that's what we found across the academies. So yes, might hit and exceed those peak intensities in your kind of conditioning drills, but that's only 20% of a session. So how can we maximize kind of our time within a session if 80% is spent in training drills? So, there's a little bit of a gap there in how we're preparing our players in those ball drills. So that's where, yes, we have this finding, but a real key part of this PhD was trying to provide a practical application. So what we did, or what I did, was I created a drill planner based off of this data. So that planner was aimed to enable practitioners, coaches at those clubs to evaluate the intensity of specific ball drills by comparing to WSL Academy match intensities. So every WSL Academy team was provided with this drill planner, and would go through examples with them. So essentially, the planner, for those of you who are a bit more sports science orientated, it uses intercept and slope values from a power law for each peak locomotor characteristic. And this sort of thing is actually required, I think, because particularly in the female game, it's underrepresented both in research and practical guides to support kind of practitioners and coaches in training prescription. And so, with that key finding in my thesis and my research, that there needs to be an increase of intensity in ball drills, that drill planner will allow coaches and practitioners to essentially plan the kind of duration of the drills that they want to be high intensity. Now, I'm not saying that every single drill should be high intensity. That's not what I'm saying, because we don't want every drill to be high intensity, right? There's different focuses for each types of drills, but there are certain drills within a session that practitioners will say, okay, we want this drill to be high intensity. But how do you know if it is high intensity or not? What are you comparing it to? Because you can't just compare it to the average intensity of a match. You need to compare it to the peak intensity. So, for example, using the drill planner, if they wanted to prescribe kind of a high intensity, small sided game, like for 4-minute small sided games, for example. They'd go out, collect the data with their kind of time motion analysis system. They'd come back in, tag the drill set duration on the dashboard, which they'd usually do when they tag drills, and then view the drill intensity on the dashboard, right? Then they actually go to the drill planner, input the actual set duration. So if it was 62 seconds, put in 62 seconds into the drill planner. And then they compare it to match intensity, which is the target speed. So the drill planner can tell you from whatever time duration you put in what the target speed should be based off of the WSL Academy peak match intensities. So the idea of that is it encourages reflection for practitioners on why that drill might or might not have achieved peak intensity for players. There could be a few different reasons if it didn't reach, for example. Could have been the number of players, the pitch size, could have been pauses for coach instruction, which when speaking to a lot of the practitioners within the academy, that was something that happened quite a lot. They would prescribe a drill, and coaches, again, physical performance may not be their priority, it might be tactical or technical performance. So they were stopping certain drills at different times for tactical instruction. So actually we said to them, can you schedule, okay, coaches are going to stop at this time point for tactical instruction. So that maintains the intensity of that set, because simply just, stopping a drill for tactical instruction, let's say for a minute, and then just adding a minute on to the end, that just increases the volume or affects the volume. It doesn't affect the intensity. And I think that's what's really key that we found in this research is full drill intensities generally not high enough within WSL academies. And that was also linked to our findings around acceleration and deceleration, which I know is a big kind of talking point at the minute within the wider research. But players may be underexposed to high magnitude accelerations and decelerations, particularly if we're looking across a microcycle. Across all 3 leagues, there was very little variability in high magnitude accels and decels throughout the training week, which was interesting to look at. And I think there is kind of a lot of research that's starting to suggest that maybe we need to increase kind of exposure to those hard accels and decels. But we do need to take into consideration what the thresholds were for accels and decels, because there is, and again, this is kind of a wider debate, but there's no standardized speed thresholds or accel decel thresholds in the women's game, which does make it difficult to compare to other research studies and other literature too. So yeah, always worth keeping that in mind when looking at research papers.
So did you find even within your research that even though like there was a paper by Dawn Scott and Rick Lovell in like 2019 that talked about trying to set female specific speed thresholds, that's still not really applied within the female like football space predominantly?
Yeah. So those speed thresholds we actually applied in our research with the FA, and I know FIFA has adopted those thresholds as well. But even with that happening, they're still not standardized across the consistency across research in the women's game. Even in the last couple of years, there's been research papers published that have used different speed thresholds, and they are senior speed thresholds as well. So although in the research that we conducted, we did apply those senior thresholds to the WSL academies because we wanted to compare between those competitive levels. So we needed to use the same speed thresholds. Again, there'll be the debate over kind of your arbitrary, generalized and individualized speed thresholds. But on a study at this scale, it wasn't feasible to use individualized speed thresholds. So yeah, there's still much debate in this area, and there's no real consistency. So I think that's definitely somewhere that we need to try and find in the women's football research community, is because if we're using similar speed thresholds or same speed thresholds, then it's easier to compare between our studies to really understand what's happening in different leagues in different countries. But also, should there be age specific speed thresholds? I know I mentioned Alice before, but I know Alice Harkness Armstrong did a bit of work on this in her PhD as well, around age specific speed thresholds, particularly for under 16, under 14s. So yeah, I think the answer is it's still pretty messy out there in terms of speed thresholds.
Because out of curiosity, and again, like I know we can talk about some research into the women's field as well, but like when you were doing like your literature review, when you were doing like your studies, did you ever think why is there little to no research actually done in the women's like general space as well, not just within women's football, but it seems that like there's a lack of like research across the women's like athletic performance like space as well.
Yeah, yeah, it's definitely getting better, and you can see that a couple of visuals I've seen recently of the kind of the number of research studies in women's sport increasing over the last few years. But um, I think like a big part of that is resource, because particularly like women's football's pretty good compared to other women's sports in terms of resource as well. But even in my experience, there's disparity in resource and staff um, being kind of overworked because there's not enough staff members, even within the same league. So I think the difficulties of then trying to do some research in that environment, if you're maybe one staff member in a sports science department, there's only one person, then that can be really difficult. I think what could be a really kind of neat step is if there are more um, clubs that actually have a research and development department or research innovation department that research needs to go through, so they can make sure that research actually aligns to a performance question for the women's team, for example, and it's not simply a let's do a study that's been done in the men's just because it hasn't been done in the women's. So I think for me that's kind of the next step is, and I know there's a lot of people working really hard on this in different areas that I've seen too, and it is getting better. But yeah, I think it's down to kind of resource within those clubs to do that research is probably why there's such a little amount.
I think you mentioned the key point there. It's like there seems to be like the assumption that we can just replicate what has been done within the men's compare and just
Mm.
apply that within the women's as well, which obviously is quite a fallacy within this space as well. So, which leads us on nicely to the paper you actually like suggested as part of this, which again we'll put a link to it as part of the podcast for those that are listening as well. So, do you want to just give an overview of like the research that you pointed out as well?
Yeah, so I've picked Steve McWilliams' paper from 2022. He did a survey comparing the current strength training methods used in men's and women's first team and academy football. So essentially comparing current practices of S&C coaches in men's and women's soccer. I think the data was collected around 2020 as well. So yeah, I thought it was a really interesting study, and I think it fits in with, I suppose, what I'm kind of passionate about and interested in, and it fits in sort of to my findings in terms of my research around the women's game, and that need. So I think in this study, there's about 170 practitioner responses from Europe, South America, and the UK in terms of S&C practice. So yeah, I just want to kind of chat about this paper, I suppose, a little bit. They found that there was no difference in the age that boys and girls start a formal S&C program at the age of 13 years. I think it's 13 plus or minus 2, 0.2. So I think for me that point's really interesting because boys and girls are starting a formal S&C program at the same age. So that's point one, and I'll come back to it. Secondly, I think they found that boys' academies actually had more in-season weekly S&C sessions compared to girls, but women's and men's first team actually had the same in terms of frequency. So at the senior level, there's the same exposure to S&C, but at the academy level, that exposure is different, of boys being exposed to more than girls. So I think that's really interesting if you kind of look at what we found in terms of like drill intensity, right? Um, but if girls are starting exposure to formal S&C sessions or programs at the age of 13, the onset of puberty and kind of peak height velocity for girls actually can occur earlier than that. I think it's, from the age of 11 to 13. I think Steve actually writes that in the paper. And for boys, it's a bit later, like from age 12 to 15. So what they found is that female academy football players start strength and conditioning programs, formal strength and conditioning programs, at a later stage of maturation than boys. Um, so why does that happen? Right? Like, yeah, there's a difference between, I think, equality and equity, and I come back to this quite a lot when we discuss kind of the differences between male and female sports. But so they start at the same age, but different in terms of maturation levels. So females are actually starting late compared to males. And then at senior level, there's the same amount of S&C exposure. So there's essentially a cramming effect that happens for female players once they transition from that under 21 academy space to a senior first team environment. Um, and that coincides with increased training frequency and volume and increased fixture congestion as well, particularly in the last few years in the women's senior game. So therefore, that could then it might increase the risk of non-contact soft tissue injuries, which are quite prevalent in the women's game. So for me, I think this paper is really interesting because I think it's kind of the first, from what I've seen, the first paper that really actually opens that up for us all to see, particularly at a time where in 2020 kind of academies were starting to become available. So it'd be really interesting to like repeat that study or see, has there been an earlier kind of introduction to formal S&C for female academy players, and has the frequency increased in that academy space for female players? Because the demands of the game are increasing. We know that from every major tournament at the highest level, we see an increase in those high intensity actions and high speed running. And those increased high intensity demands require more advanced physical qualities and improved athletic development strategies from a younger age in girls. So that development of those physical qualities of players is required to not only enhance performance, because we know there's a difference between competitive levels, but they're also required to reduce injury risk as well. And I know that's quite a topic area at the minute, with a lot of different organizations researching particularly the kind of influence of hormonal fluctuations on kind of female players and particularly ACL injuries. But it's not necessarily just ACL injuries, it's like non-contact soft tissue injuries as a whole. So all in all, I think, yeah, girls require greater exposure to S&C at a younger age to develop relative strength and other kind of force production qualities. So yeah, I've kind of rambled on a little bit there, Steve.
No, no, it's good. It's good that you're passionate about this space as well. And I think like
Yeah.
one of the interesting things I found about this paper when you sent it through as well is that like round Europe particularly, and again I know like it happens like in other parts of the world as well, but there is a theory that like being able to play like girls against boys is better for the player's development from a girl's perspective as well. And so, like, it's interesting to see like this S&C criteria because ultimately, at what age, like, should you stop playing boys against girls, for example, from a physical perspective? And you mentioned about bio-banding and the earlier development phases of women. So it's a really interesting kind of like hot topic that could be explored. And you kind of mentioned it, but I suppose just to probably like bring the this episode of the podcast to a wrap as well. Like what, and this is more specific on you, not just within women's football as well. But what's kind of next for you, and where do you see like the research going and kind of sports science strategies that you're supporting with? Where do you see like the future with them as well?
Yeah, I think yeah, as you can tell, I'm pretty passionate about kind of the women's game, but I think what's really important is actually I'd like to see kind of more clubs and organizations actually have a dedicated research and innovation department, like I mentioned earlier, because I do see a lot of times research studies conducted maybe in that academic setting, what the practical applications aren't useful in an applied setting for a club. You know, there needs to be there's that mix between fast and slow um, impact. So like your fast impact is during a study, right? So you know that might be having someone embedded at a club or someone who works at a club conducting research that you can get some impacts during the project, not just waiting till the end of a project. Because in football and in all elite sport, like particularly team-based sports, things move on. You know, coaches aren't necessarily going to care what happens in 3 years, but they are going to care what happens next week when they've got 3 games. So being able to provide that fast feedback, I think, is really important. So I think what I'd like to see, and I suppose where my expertise is it comes in, is around that research and innovation, and actually finding and developing research studies to answer performance questions that clubs have. Like they actually want to know what will actually impact them day to day. Um, so that will ensure that any research that's conducted is aligned, it's targeted, and those impacts and outcomes are actually measured throughout a project and not just lost when a project finishes after, you know, let's say for example a 3 year cycle. So there's a legacy for those projects, and I think yeah, there needs to be um, a bit more kind of impetus and understanding of in female game. We don't necessarily need to replicate studies that have been done in the men's game. We can be innovative as well, and I think that people are open to that too. So
So,
yeah,
so
I'll leave it there.
no, no, I'm gonna dive a bit deeper into that before we wrap up. It's like, what is kind of like your from your learnings? What's your kind of dream research project that you would like to go and conduct or do or question to answer, shall we say?
um, I think what would be really interesting is we know with with my research, like I measured external load, right? I've not measured internal load, and I think obviously internal load is imposed as a response to that external load. So I actually think it'd be really cool to understand what are or how the moderating effects of female specific physiology affect dose response outcomes. So we know females fatigue differently to males, so maybe having like internal measures of um, pre, post, and during training drills to understand what the female specific response is to different drill types and intensities. Um, because then hopefully that would inform kind of better training periodization and drill prescription. Um, but I think being in a position where I can kind of influence or support kind of practitioners who have that question, they might not necessarily have it as refined, but being able to help them refine that question in this example, for example, would be pretty cool to do.
And I'll finish by saying thank you very much. That was really insightful, and I really enjoyed listening to all the insights into like the female research space and your PhD as well. For anyone else that might have enjoyed listening to that and wanted to get in touch with you, what's the best methods for them to reach out to you as well?
Yeah, probably either Twitter or X as it's known now, or
Go with the
LinkedIn.
times, Naomi. Come on, X.
I'm stuck in the old days, clearly.
There you go. So X is the best way. Are you on LinkedIn, or what's email address for
Yeah,
anyone that wants to reach out as well?
yeah, on LinkedIn, just my name, Naomi Myhill, and Twitter, same thing as well. Email address, naomimyhill@gmail.com.
Thank you very much, Naomi, for your time, and thank you to the listeners for listening to the latest episode of the Sports Science Insights podcast. I've been Steve Barrett, and I look forward to hopefully seeing you on the next episode.